If the protests in Ottawa and across Canada were in fact illegal occupations and illegal blockades, why would you need extra governmental powers to dismantle them? You wouldn't. So yesterday there was a vote in Parliament to uphold or to revoke the Emergencies Act that was invoked by the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party. With one vote, the Liberal Party and the NDP made a joke of the entire Canadian political and legal system. They've disregarded the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the rule of law and the body of law that holds Canada together at every turn for the past 2 years, so it's not surprising. But there is a simple criteria to be able to invoke the Emergencies Act. As you can see here, the Emergencies Act clearly lays out the criteria for when it can be invoked. An act to authorize the taking of special temporary measures to ensure safety and security during national emergencies and to amend other acts in consequence thereof. So a national emergency is required for this act to be invoked. What is a national emergency? It goes on to define. For the purpose of this act, a national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of temporary nature that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. If you have a brain, it is very clear that this criteria is not met, making the invocation of the Emergencies Act illegitimate on its face. It should never even been brought to a vote. But what this vote yesterday perfectly exemplifies is the problem with a democracy. It's important to remember that Hitler was democratically elected, and everything that Hitler did was legal. All you need in a democracy is 51% of the vote, and a 51% simple majority can essentially vote to execute the other 49%. If there actually was a national emergency, which is what the Emergencies Act is designed for, it is a wartime provision, there would be essentially 100% of Parliament that would vote to invoke the Emergencies Act. It's scary and it brings to light fatal flaws with the Canadian political system that you do not need a supermajority to essentially give the Prime Minister of the country dictatorial powers. The vote was 185 to 151. That makes up approximately 55% of Parliament. So instead of this actually being a national emergency, this was essentially a partisan power grab. Again, if there was a national emergency, you would not need to convince anyone that there in fact was. The Liberals have repeatedly referred to the protests across Canada and Ottawa as illegal occupations and illegal blockades. If they were in fact illegal, you would not need emergency powers to dismantle them. So just like everything the Liberals do, they do not need to justify themselves or prove anything. And as of yesterday, there were no more protesters in Ottawa. So the occupation doesn't exist anymore. So you would think that the Emergencies Act wouldn't be necessary and they could just drop the vote and wouldn't even have to consider upholding this invocation. But no, the justification is that they might come back at some point in the near or distant future. So we need to track their communication because otherwise these evil, horrible people that are fighting for their freedom might come back and honk in the streets of Ottawa. What the truckers did and what the protesters, the millions of protesters across Canada that represent millions more that support them, was exactly what a protest is supposed to be. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms explicitly protects certain fundamental freedoms. As you can see here in Section 2, freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media communication, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. Freedom of peaceful assembly. This was a 2.5-week protest. Unlike BLM or Antifa or other environmental protests, there was not a window shattered, there was not a police officer attacked, there was no burning of buildings, there was no looting, no stealing. There was one Nazi flag and one Confederate flag. And those two people were completely masked and, again, if you have a brain, were clearly plants to try and demonize this protest. What we saw in the last 3 weeks was food donations, the cleaning up of garbage in the streets, the shoveling of snow in the streets, hugs, celebrations. What we saw was the quintessential peaceful protest. But since it put into question Justin Trudeau's edicts, it was required that he demonize them and eventually give himself dictatorial powers to freeze the bank accounts of Canadians and suspend habeas corpus. Trudeau himself said years ago, when governments ask its citizens to give up even a small portion of their liberty, it is not simply enough to say, trust us. That trust must be earned, it must be checked, and it must be renewed. What the Liberals have done in the last couple of weeks is a masterclass in rhetoric manipulation. They lie so effectively that they even begin to believe their lies. The tactics that they employed were right out of Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. Accuse your opponent of exactly what you are guilty of. For 2 years, they have blockaded the Canadian economy and the Canadian people's lives arbitrarily without ever needing to justify themselves. And now protesters fighting for freedom inconvenience politicians in Ottawa for a short period of time, for 2 weeks. And their most egregious act, honking and double parking. And suddenly it's an occupation, it's an illegal occupation, and they are putting at risk the national security and the health of Canadians. This is fiction. This is a fiction that they have created and they create for themselves with the help of the mainstream media, which they fund and which Trudeau will brag about.
You sometimes hear about liberal bias in the media these days, how they're constantly letting our government off the hook for no good reason. Frankly, I think that's insulting. It's clear that they let us off the hook for a very good reason, because we paid them $600 million. You don't get stellar headlines like these without greasing the wheels a bit.
Trudeau said that one of the reasons the Emergencies Act needed to be invoked was because there was foreign funding through crowdfunding websites that was destabilizing Canadian democracy. I would like to ask for one example of a large donation by some supposed foreign actor that was trying to destabilize the Canadian democracy. The people that donated to the protest were individual sovereign people who agreed with the fight for freedom. What we have seen is that cryptocurrencies and crowdfunding websites pose a large threat to the established political elite because it truly allows for people to vote with their hard-earned money. And it allows people to bypass these huge bureaucracies that our governments establish. What I want to know now is what happens when there's an actual emergency, when we are actually at war. What this vote has done is bastardized the Canadian political system and really made a joke of it. It has allowed for an extremely partisan political party to grab unlimited power over the Canadian people and uproot the entire Canadian system. The Emergencies Act was designed to be used in times of war. In 1970, Trudeau's father invoked the Emergencies Act, and this was at a time when the FLQ, the Front de Libération de Québec, were bombing and kidnapping politicians. They kidnapped 2 politicians and they killed one of them.
For 7 years, beginning in 1963, FLQ terrorist cells in Quebec unleash a deadly bombing campaign against English domination in a fight for an independent Quebec.
And even at the time, when the Premier of Quebec requested for him to invoke the Emergencies Act, it was controversial. At the time, it was called the War Measures Act. This time around, 7 premiers have opposed his invocation of the Emergencies Act. It's very clear why, because there is no serious danger to the lives or health or safety of Canadians. There is political danger to Justin Trudeau because he has made himself one of the most hated men in the world. The whole world sees you for what you are, Justin Trudeau. You're a petty tyrant, you're having a tantrum, you're a spoiled brat who doesn't have a speck of humility. You have no capacity to even fathom the possibility of you being wrong. As you said yesterday, we know we're right in the invocation of this Emergencies Act. Now, I don't know what the recourse is following this vote, but there's clearly something wrong with the Canadian political system. And we need to have a discussion about what happens to politicians when they clearly contradict established law and the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms with mandates that are arbitrary, that are far-reaching, that suspend the civil liberties of Canadians. We live in a free society. This is a gift to us. But there are some things that need to be reformed to ensure that we continue to live in a free society.